Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We are joined today by Professor James Smethurst, who's Professor of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. A prolific scholar, Professor Smethurst is the author of Left of the Color Line, Race, Radicalism, and 20th Century Literature in the United States. That's 2003. The classic, The Black Arts Movement, Literary Nationalism in the 1960s and 1970s, 2005. African-American Roots of Modernism, Reconstruction to the Harlem Renaissance, 2011. And he's also the co-editor of the important collection, the first real collection of Black Arts Movement literature, SOS, Calling All Black People, a Black Arts Movement Reader, which was co-edited with John H. Bracy Jr., and Sonia Sanchez. These were all published by the University of North Carolina Press. And of course, he's also the author of Brick City Vanguard, Amiri Baraka, Black Music and Black Modernity, which was published in 2020 by the University of Massachusetts Press. He's joining us today to talk about his latest book, Behold the Land, the Black Arts Movement in the South, of which Howard Ransby II describes this book is vital and visionary. James Smethurst's exemplary study accomplishes the task of presenting the extensive work of a diverse group of African-American artists across the South. And our friend Margot Natalie Crawford says of Behold the Land, meticulously researched and beautifully written, Behold the Land is bound to become the definitive study of the Black Arts Movement in the South. How are you doing today, Professor Smethurst?
I'm good, Mark. How are you?
I'm doing well. Yeah, in many ways, your body of work now for 20 years, if there's a starting point to talk about a recap, for lack of a better way to describe it, a critical recap of the Black Arts Movement, it's your work. What made you turn specifically to the South, with this particular project?
Well, when I did my first book on the Black Arts Movement, which had its own sort of long genesis, and as you know, it's organized somewhat historically, but also geographically. Mm-hmm. And I have a chapter on the South. And as I explored the South, the story was just fascinating to me. And I realized that the South was far more consequential in the story of the Black Arts Movement, and far more consequential really in the story of literature and art in the United States than had been allowed before. I'm sure you know the sort of truism about Black arts and Black power and civil rights, as civil rights was predominantly a Southern, significantly rural phenomenon or small town phenomenon, in the Black Belt, and that Black arts and Black power were significantly northern and western and urban. And the more I got into it, that just struck me as a completely, well, if not completely, a substantially distorted view of it. That there was obviously important civil rights movement activity in the North and the West, be it Boston school desegregation or Chicago school boycotts or Philadelphia economic boycotts over employment. And, Black power and Black arts took hold often out of the civil rights movement in the South at a very early time. So anyway, I tried to, I was really fascinated by it. And so I sort of started going down that path, if that, I guess, for lack of a better way of doing it. As I often do, I often sort of fall into things. I get fascinated by some kind of problem or question and say, okay, I start off with, I guess, how come, kinds of questions.
Yeah, one of the things that Behold the Land reveals, and I guess this is something that is widely known, but perhaps not talked about enough, but there's a way in which all Black culture is Southern culture, right? You just dig deeper, 1, 2, 3 generations, right? And there's always a Southern root there. And even when we think about, seminal Black arts figures, poets at least, folks like, Nikki Giovanni and Gil Scott-Heron as two examples. I mean, a lot of their work really comes together during the time that they're in the South.
Right.
You know, by the time they get that kind of urban sheen of the early 1970s, we no longer think of them, you know, in the same way as Southern artists. One of the things you talk about, you know, because the challenge of thinking about the South is like this crucible for
Right.
Black arts. You know, we tend to not think about the organizing in the South as being as sophisticated and theoretical, if you will, of the kind of stuff that we see out of, you know, Black nationalist thought that emerges, you know, in the 1960s. But you make the point that what's happening in the South is particularly unique because of the impact of the Popular Front. If you could talk a little bit about, you know, for the audience about, you know, why the Popular Front was significant, and in particular, the Southern version of it, or, you know, Black version of it, you know, in the 1930s.
Okay, yeah, I think that I can talk about that. I mean, the other thing I do want to say, and maybe you were planning to get to this, which interfaces with the Popular Front and makes the South unique, are the historically Black colleges and universities.
Absolutely.
Which means that there are a handful in the North, in Ohio and Pennsylvania, but the overwhelming majority are in the South, including, and in North Carolina, I mean, there are tens of thousands of Black students in HBCUs at the time I'm speaking of. I mean, far more. The Duke, for example, I mean, the students there play an outsized role in what will happen, but nevertheless, you know, they're the small numbers. And that these schools then, as a result, you know, of being there, I mean, they hire Black artists, they hire Black intellectuals, they train Black and writers, they train Black artists and intellectuals. A huge percentage of the Black arts people, a very large number go to HBCUs. You know, Baraka, for example, goes to Howard. A.B. Spellman goes to Howard. Nikki Giovanni goes to Fisk.
Yes.
You know, Tony, or else, and then others who didn't go, they teach there. Tony Cade, Bombara, you know. Okay, so the Popular Front, you know, I mean, that's a long story, and I'm not sure it's a rabbit hole you want me to go down entirely, but the short form is, I mean, then there's always a Black liberation movement. There always are civil rights movement struggle going on in the South. One of the things that happens in the Popular Front era, you know, the sort of left-wing movement, you know, primarily associated with the Communist Party, is one of the things about the Communist Party is, besides the fact that they, for, you know, again, it's a long story, put Black liberation, however you may honest you feel that they were, or how they executed at the center of their work, is they also, because the Black liberation, or Negro liberation, as they said, and the national question was a central focus for them for a long time, from the late 20s on, they basically said that social progress in this country can't happen as long as the South, you know, the Jim Crow South remains untouched. You can't have a revolutionary movement that's only in the Northeast and the Midwest and the West. You have to deal with the South, which also means, I mean, partly because of the Black liberation was so important, that means that, you know, if you're talking about Black liberation, you're demographically, historically, you have to talk about the South. Most Black people, even in the 60s, lived in the South, as they do now in this country. And so demographically, but also politically, you cannot leave that area as sort of a bastion of unrelieved reaction, right? In other words, you can't have the, so anyway, so they did work, they did work in the South, and that at considerable risk. And so you had this movement where you have indigenous, I guess, Black and white Southerners, primarily Black Southerners. The Communist Party and the Popular Front in the South, it's a pretty Black affair for the most part. They have, you know, they're white people, and if you're talking about Texas, Latinx people, involved in it, but that, primarily African American. And so, it struggles around labor, struggles around Jim Crow. The Southern Negro Youth Congress is a really important, which is where Behold the Land, the name comes from, as a speech that Du Bois gave at a conference in South Carolina that was basically organized by the SNYC, the first SNCC, if you will.
Yeah, let's talk about the Southern Negro Youth Congress for a moment. James Jackson, in particular Edith Cooper Jackson, who apparently is still alive.
Oh yeah, yeah,
and well in her hundreds. Talk about how significant they were in terms of coalescing and bringing together a kind of movement that wedded what was happening politically with the arts in that moment.
Well, I think they're very important. These are very important people. I mean, both are important for what they did in the South. They had this vision of struggle that involved both political activism, including direct political activism, around the poll tax, around Jim Crow, around education, around labor, and so forth, that involved culture. So that the journal of the SNYC Cavalcade involved poetry, involved stories. Langston Hughes, Waring Cuney, who they sponsored a couple of theaters, one in New Orleans, one in Richmond, James Jackson's hometown. I mean, and Esther Cooper Jackson wasn't from very far from Richmond, closer to Alexandria. And they had this puppet caravan theater, which I believe Esther Cooper Jackson was part of it, and also Waring Cuney, who was a very important poet of the Harlem Renaissance, out of Boston initially, eventually New York, and so they had this approach of politics and culture from the very beginning as a way of how you reach people, how you build community. New Orleans was a hotbed. Birmingham was a hotbed, particularly. South Carolina, Miami eventually. I mean, one of my favorite stories, and they use culture in creative ways. One of my favorite stories is how in Alabama, northern Alabama, James Jackson and a very young Pete Seeger used to go around to miners' camps. They mined coal in northern Alabama. Many of the miners would be Black, and they would do this sort of flip thing on the patent medicine show. The patent medicine shows where you'd have a white barker and then a Black guy playing the banjo, playing music, and it would attract a crowd, and then the guy would give the patent medicine speech. They did a flip thing where they had a white guy playing the banjo, Pete Seeger, and then James Jackson being the barker, except instead of talking about patent medicines, he was talking about poll taxes and labor rights and so forth. And apparently the sight of that was so arresting that they would attract huge crowds because, the picture of a white guy playing the banjo for a Black speaker, that's a kind of, creative stuff that they did. In other words, what I'm saying is that they not only organized theater, and cultural events. They had an art show they sponsored in Birmingham, and that but they had a theatrical or cultural approach even to political. In other words, it wasn't just James Jackson getting up on a soapbox or a ladder or whatever and giving a political speech about Jim Crow. They had that theater of it, they had that sense.
You mentioned Pete Seeger, right? And you described this chapter as, these folks are really the ancestors to the Black arts movement. But you're really talking about with the Southern Negro Youth Congress, right? A history that predates our, Highlander, right? We often think about Highlanders as like incubation moment that creates, the political kind of sensibilities that emerge in the 50s and the 60s and the civil rights movement. But this is really something that predates Highlander.
Well, right. Or if it doesn't predate Highlander, it predates the Highlander that we come to know.
No, right.
Because, Highlander in its early days was very careful about, and I'm not really saying, well, maybe I'm being a little critical. They were pretty careful about violating the Jim Crow laws. In other words, they were not the interracial place to quite the extent they became later. And I think it's under the influence of the Popular Front, and that kind of Popular Front, really Black-led interracialism. So when you say it's interracialism, it's, to a large extent, like the leaders of these movements are in the South are Black by and large, because that's who's in the Communist Party in the South. For a variety of reasons, Alabama, it's, there are white people, but it's overwhelmingly the Hosea Hudson, the Jacksons, the Burnhams, and so forth. Some of whom are from the North, like Louis Burnham, who's of Caribbean descent, grew up in New York City, or people who are Southerners, like the Jacksons.
Right. Your title of the book is Behold the Land. And it comes from a speech from W. Du Bois, as you mentioned. Edith Cooper Jackson, befriends Du Bois and really is, fairly close with him for the rest of his life. What was the significance of that speech, and why was it important for you to use it as a title for this particular historical book?
Well, I think because, and there are echoes that you can think of when in Malcolm X, in his famous message to the grassroots, where he's talking about land and revolution. And then, of course, in somewhat later, which has reverberations today in Jackson, Mississippi, of the Republic of New Africa, Free the Land. This notion of the land, this very complex idea of the connection of Black people in the United States to the South, and the South as the land, that they have a particular connection to it. And I wanted to get that in there. It's partly demographic, again, it's other words where most Black people, even after the Great Migration, most Black people are still living in the South.
Right.
They're more urbanized than they were in the early 20th century. So, it's not so much, even though they're important, Lowndes County or Sunflower County or whatever, but it's, Atlanta, Jackson, New Orleans, Little Rock, and so Memphis and Nashville and so on. But that this notion that there is a demographic importance to it, but there's a historical importance to it, a spiritual importance to it, this notion of the land. It's basically, sort of the stepping off place, unwillingly, admittedly, the closest connection in the United States to Africa is in the South. And so that virtually any vision of Black nationalism, at least post-Garvey, is a vision that, encompasses the South as sort of ground zero of the Black nation in the United States.
Yeah.
Baraka, that was actually my book before, was very much about talking about how Baraka talks about, who himself was a product. Both his parents were born and grew up in the early years in the South, and had to flee racial violence in the South. Right. To Newark, which was a very Southern city by the 1960s in many respects. I'm a New Jersey person, and I remember my grandfather, who was born and raised in New Jersey. It wasn't so much just the demographic change, but he was very bemused, not hostile, but bemused because of the cultural way in which Newark changed from a northern city in his childhood to really a substantially southern city.
Yeah.
And he talked about that. But anyhow, Baraka talks about how the bedrock of the Black nation is in the South. And then what he traces is how then it becomes transmuted, with the growth of a Black industrial working class in places like Newark.
Yeah.
But because of the Great Migration, the southernness of Black people in the United States, as you said earlier on, keeps getting reinfused, right? because there are Black people coming into Newark, large numbers of Black people moving from the South into Newark right up until through the 70s. So I guess what I'm saying here is when I use the land because it's a really good articulation of both of a certain genealogy of Black radicalism and, a reminder, of this long history in the South, which, as Robin Kelly points out, some of the people who came from the North to the South were surprised when they got there, during the Civil Rights era, to find that there was this memory, this Black radical memory, Marxist even, leftist, as well as nationalist memory, that they thought, they didn't expect that they came from New York City, say, or Chicago or something. They didn't expect that they would find that. Some of them didn't. Some of them were somewhat surprised to find that people remember the Sharecroppers Union and SNYC and other forms of the Food, Tobacco, and Agricultural Workers Union, these sort of left-wing groups that have been active down there. If that gives you an idea. So that, it's the idea of the land, which really reverberates, like, again, to this day, this notion of the land, of Black land, of a land that people are particularly tied to, that we see in, like, Free the Land, which, then reverberates again with the election of Chokwe Lumumba to mayor in Jackson.
Right.
Or even North Carolina, there's a sense when Reverend Barber's talking about new fusion politics, he's talking about a genealogy of Black radicalism, which has a certain interracial aspect to it. But Black radicalism, if it's interracialism with Black people in the lead.
Yeah.
And that goes way back.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned, this idea of Black-led interracialism, and even Jackson herself has talked about, in the context of the Southern Negro Youth Congress, the outsized role that women played in that organization.
Right.
In comparison to, other ways that we think of gendered leadership and civil rights and Black power organizations, as it developed in the 60s and the 70s. It's almost as if there was, rather than something in the water, there was clearly something in the soil. Right, that was creating a kind of a more radical and expansive vision of what was possible.
Right. No, I think that's absolutely true.
One of the dots that you connect, the lines that you connect, and thinking about this kind of almost false dichotomy between Northern and Southern, is the magazine Freedomways, right? And of course, we think of Freedomways as a kind of byproduct of this, cosmopolitan Black 50s and 60s, radicalism, that comes together around folks like Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee and a host of other folks. But you really talk about the Southern roots of Freedomways. And again, to mention that name again, either Cooper Jackson, the role of leading that organization and that, journal for the years that it did, that connects these kind of ideas of politics and arts.
Well, right. And that, my argument is that in some respects, Freedomways was taking sort of the Black, what Mary Helen Washington calls the Black cultural front, and also the Black popular front of the South, and that style of organizing, that style of thinking about the connection of art, culture, politics, and so forth, North. Because if you look at the people who founded the journal and who came up with it, even before Esther Cooper Jackson, people, like the Burnhams, the only people who really were on the ground floor at the beginning who weren't really Southerners were the Du Boises, Shirley Graham and W.E.B. Du Bois, who were involved with the organization, sort of conceptualization of Freedomways. Freedomways is very much a kind of Southern popular front, Black popular front journal in some ways, but recalibrated for a new moment, recalibrated for what the Black radicals of the time called the Bandung era, or the Bandung world, and recalibrated for the new freedom movement in the South, that new possibilities had opened up in '61. You know, that was the same, the journal basically is founded the same year as the Black student movement really takes off and coalesces into more or less, you know, within a year of when SNCC is formed. So that there are these new possibilities, which is, you know, kind of where Esther Cooper Jackson always was. You know, I mean, she is, as far as the communist left goes, or what was left of it in the early '60s, I mean, she's much more open to Black nationalism than some people were, including maybe her husband. You know, people like Hakeem Madhubuti, other people associated with Black arts, published in
Freedomways.
Freedomways.
You mentioned earlier the HBCUs and how critical they were to this development. You know, I was struck when you wrote that, you know, very often HBCUs hired, because they were good teachers and good scholars, you know, radicals and militants, you know, within their ranks, who wouldn't have an opportunity, obviously, to work, you know, at PWIs, you know, primarily white institutions. And, you know, and while some...
And they didn't fire the people who they already had, the way that a lot of PWIs did in the McCarthy era. And Sterling Brown had his problems with Howard, but he didn't lose his job there.
Yeah, one of the names that came up that was really interesting to me, you talk about Lyle Saxon, Louisiana Writers Project, right? And of course, the relationship that he builds with Dillard University, the Dillard History Unit, and specifically Lawrence Riddick, you know, who then goes on to become the first curator of the Schomburg, right? So even in this kind of very northern thing, you know, there's this kind of southern connection there. And one of the things that struck me about your conversation about what's happening in New Orleans around HBCUs and some of these arts movements is that these were folks that created a usable past, right? An archive, right? Almost like an evergreen dynamic that would be useful for later New Orleans organizers and artists and other folks to be able to go back to. Talk a little bit about the Louisiana Writers Project and what kind of opportunities it provided, you know, for some of the artists who are working in New Orleans, Louisiana, and other places.
Well, okay, you know, so I mean, it's a very important thing, and yeah, it becomes associated with Dillard, but I think it's part of the broader sort of Black Popular Front, or whatever you want to call it, or a kind of Black radical led interracialism in New Orleans. There's something called the People's Defense League that's very important there. You know, the Longshore unions are involved in it, and also the Writers Projects. So Saxton who's a white guy, is a pretty interesting person, because he is someone who comes out of this sort of bohemian, but is pretty early on interested and supportive of Black writers and artists in New Orleans. He comes out of this sort of bohemian scene in the French Quarter that includes people at certain times, like a young William Faulkner is there, a young, and then Sherwood Anderson sort of floats through there at times. And they had a journal called The Double Dealer, which is an early sort of publisher of Jean Toomer. And reviewer of Kane, you know, and so forth. And they're very, you know, and he's a part of that, although Jim Crow is such that, you know, that's not really what you would call an interracial circle in the way that became possible in the 30s. So, I mean, one of the things, partly because of the strength of the left, and relatively in New Orleans, because of Saxton himself, you know, they hire Black people to the work, the project, and they started the Dillard History Unit at, you know, the History Unit at Dillard. So there's Reddick, there's Marcus Christian, a printer, a poet, who is very important actually in the Black arts period. A guy named Octave Lilly, who'd been active in the end of sort of a left iteration, I guess, you know, radical iteration of both of the NAACP I think New Iberia, where Queen Mother Moore comes from, originally, who gets driven out of town by vigilantes and ends up in New Orleans. And they, so New Orleans, becomes, and Louisiana becomes a relatively unusual place in the South, in that, most writers' projects in the South don't hire a lot of Black people.
Right.
Because they're run by, basically segregationists. That's not so true. That's not true in New Orleans, in Louisiana. It's also somewhat not true in Florida, where Zora Neale Hurston is working for the WPA.
Yeah.
Although she has an odd relationship to the left in the 1930s and becomes, actually quite anti-left and anti-communist by the 40s. But that's another story. So I think it's important. I mean, like the WPA everywhere, well, not everywhere, but everywhere they hire Black people, which is generally everywhere where the left is strong.
Right.
New York, Chicago, Cleveland, the Bay Area and San Francisco to some degree, Detroit. What it means is it's for the first time in history in the United States, you have large numbers of Black people who are making their living primarily through their, through visual art, through theater, through writing. They're getting paid to do that. I mean, one thing that's hard for us to remember, say, about the 30s, is that Langston Hughes, before the WPA, was really, I think, just about the only Black writer who made his living basically entirely through his writing. He didn't have, it wasn't like Sterling Brown. He didn't have a gig at an HBCU. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't, didn't have some other sort of breadwinning job he made. And that's one of the reasons why Hughes writes so many things in so many genres, and he does it brilliantly, almost in all of them, because he was, he writes journalism. He writes the From Here to Yonder column, which Simple comes out of. He does those tours through the South, and he's doing all kinds of things. He writes plays. He would like to write screenplays, but as he points out, Hollywood is too Jim Crow for him to be a screenwriter. He can't do what Faulkner or Fitzgerald do, but because he's, partly because he's interested, but partly because he's trying to make a living.
Yeah, I was struck, when you talked about the opportunity for artists to make a living, and I'm thinking specifically, you talk about the work of Hale Woodruff, the visual artist, and
he's really important.
The Talladega murals, which, looking at them, I mean, they're strikingly radical. In a period of time where we don't think about necessarily, radical Black art in the way that we think about it in the Black Power era, in the 60s and 70s.
Right. Absolutely. Or John Biggers in Houston.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, and Hale Woodruff, I mean, in the visual arts, I mean, he establishes at, Atlanta University Center, basically, Morehouse and Spelman, this visual arts tradition is incredibly important. And the thing that's important is that, how many of these folks are trained, that he trains in the South, and that other people like Elizabeth Catlett, who's at Hampton for a while, train in the South, then go on to be important in the Black arts period. I mean, you can draw a direct line from Catlett, who was promoted by Hale Woodruff, among other people, in Atlanta, to the Wall of Respect.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not just, intellectually or ideologically or even aesthetically in terms of, their approach, but you could actually personally, there were people who did the Wall of Respect who were students of Elizabeth Catlett at Hampton or Samela Lewis.
Right.
But yeah, and that's, really important. You know, one of the things though that I try to get at in the book, and I hope I'm not jumping the gun here, is the way in which, you know, after the end of the, you know, the Popular Front, which was smashed flat in the South.
Right.
I mean, there were remnants of it, but very, very little could exist above ground.
Right.
Because of the virulence of the Cold War and the McCarthy era in the South, which was worse probably there than any place, especially for Black people. I mean, there's a reason why the Jacksons had to go north.
Right, right.
By Ed Strong, that he was the guy I was trying to remember, Ed Strong and Augustus Strong and Louise and Louis Burnham had to move north to New York and Philadelphia because it was just impossible to exist, say, in Birmingham with Bull Connor breathing down your neck. And, you know, if some people, I mean, like Angela Davis's parents were able to stay, they were a little less exposed, but, you know, most, and even the people who stayed in the South often had to move to a different city.
Right.
But, well, you know, one of the stories is, you know, the question of, so this, in a sense, the South is always a center of Black art. I mean, now, obviously in certain popular forms like R&B, you know, South is always the epicenter, really.
Right.
I mean, you know, Chicago, Cincinnati, other places, Los Angeles, New York, yeah, okay. But, you know, the real epicenter is
the South, right?
The South. But in other art forms, visual arts, literature, theater, and so forth, you know, it always remains a center in the sense that there's always stuff going on at the HBCUs. But, you know, part of the story I tell or try to tell is how this stuff moves from the campuses to the community.
Right.
You know, how it moves, and also some ways in how the community moves to the campuses.
Yeah.
I mean, they're always, I mean, you know, like if you lived in Atlanta, which, you know, in some respects say was a cultural backwater. I mean, I don't mean it for Black, I'm not talking about Black people now. I'm just talking about the city,
in general.
I mean, you know, the city in general, say in the 1960s, was not on the Circle Line tour of cultural arts hotspots. It would have been considered, you know, resolutely provincial.
Right.
And not the way it would be now, where Atlanta in a lot of fields, you know, music, of course, but also popular music, but also visual art, theater,
broadcast news, right?
Yeah, all that kind of stuff is a national center. But you know, so the community people, if you want to go see a play, probably if you're Black in Atlanta, you probably go to one of the Atlanta University campuses, you know, Spelman, Morehouse, Atlanta, Morris, and you would see a play, or but you know, now it's, you know, that, so the story is, how does that change so that it's, you know, now Atlanta is a center not because of the schools. I mean, the schools are important, but you know, it's what's outside the schools that we know nationally, right? For the most part, in terms of arts.
You mentioned how, you know, in the crushing of the Popular Front, you know, a lot of these activities moved to community organizations. And again, going back to New Orleans, the development of the Free Southern Theater.
Oh, well, that's incredible.
Right, and Black Art South as an offshoot of that, right? And you know, I was struck by even some of the younger folks who came through the Free Southern Theater. You know, Roscoe Orman, you know, who 3 generations of kids now know, you know, as Gordon from Sesame Street, right? Or someone like a young Denise Nichols, right, who also gets engaged in civil rights movement in this moment. But we know from Room 222 in the early 70s and the Cosby Portier movies and In the Heat of the Night, right, you know, in the late 80s and 90s. It was a way for the
outside of when he, you know, went back up north to film and theater.
Right, the great director, right, exactly. How important was the Free Southern Theater, right? And of course, we got to talk about, you know, our friend Kalamu Salam, you know, in this conversation also.
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, Kalamu is great, you know, has been a great spirit and a great person, you know, not only for that kind of work that he's done over the years, but, you know, even though his Black Arts book came out after mine, drafts of it existed before my book. So, you know, he shared some of his research and
Right.
with me. So he was incredibly important to me and how I thought of, even before I was specifically thinking about the South, about the Black Arts movement as a whole. You know, he's one of those people, along with Lorenzo Thomas, who spent a long time in the South in Houston,
Right. And he's
who were both participants in the movement, but they were also scholars, you know, not necessarily, although in Lorenzo's case, he was an academic, but, you know, Kalamu has never been an academic, but I mean, he's incredibly important sort of historian. And they were crucial to me. I couldn't have, they really set me straight about a lot of stuff. So Free Southern Theater is really important. You know, it's really important because, you know, you could make the argument, if you're going to talk about when Black arts starts, or the idea of the Black arts movement, I mean, rather than thinking about the Black arts repertory theater in school, I mean, you could think about Free Southern starting in Jackson and Tougaloo, really a year before. Now, I think most of the people involved would say it was really more of a and so maybe it's more of a transitional organization, like in New York, like On Guard for Freedom, and some of the other organizations that we could think of, Umbra Poets Workshop, that were sort of proto-Black arts. But, you know, it's really a theater that from its very inception was a theater created mostly by Black people. Well, it's created by Black people, mostly populated and directed by Black people. There were some white actors and theater, I don't know what you would say, production tech, you know, like Richard Schechner, that were involved in it pretty early on. But, you know, by Black people, for Black people, for Black audiences, speaking to in different ways, and sometimes some people thought in odd ways, you know, doing Waiting for Godot out in the Mississippi Delta, say, or something like that. Though Fannie Lou Hamer was a big fan of Waiting for Godot, apparently, that she had her own take on it, but as you might imagine, that they were really important in that kind of, and community people, you know, again, you know, and in the South, to traveling to everyday people and getting enthusiastic responses. You know, they weren't the first Black theater, obviously, including in the South, because we were talking about this SNYC that was, you know, aimed at, I don't know what you would call it, everyday Black audiences, not not on the campus, but in the community. But that is really important, and you know, and their idea of trying to promote, they did plays by people who weren't Black, but you know, trying to promote Black playwrights. They did Langston Hughes, they did Ossie Davis, they did, and eventually tried to come up with their own thing. I mean, they had contradictions,
right?
You know. And so where Kalamu comes in, though, I mean, you know, well, let's talk about the contradictions. The contradiction they always had was whether or not this theater was one in which was going to be more oriented in, you know, how much it was really going to be involved with developing and producing local Southern Black artists, and theater workers and poets and so forth, writers, or were they going to be aimed more towards the theater industry, which, you know, in those days, maybe even in ours, still meant New York.
Right.
And if you're talking about films, to the degree that Black people had access to films, Los Angeles. And
this is a period before the founding of the Negro Ensemble in '67. So, you know, they're really thinking about a national traveling
well, yes,
Black theater movement.
and they're also, trying to attract people from up north,
Right,
or people like Roscoe Orman,
right,
to come, or Denise Nichols to come down and perform. But these people are people who are eventually thinking of going somewhere else.
right.
They
Hollywood, New
someone
York,
like
making a
John.
living.
I mean, ironically, John, this position was associated with John O'Neill, one of the founders, and John basically, unlike Gilbert Moses, stayed in New Orleans basically his whole career after that. I mean, he never really left. But there are other people who were more interested in thinking about, okay, let's develop indigenous talent.
Right.
Let's build a Southern network, a Southern eventually Black arts network. And there were these workshops, and Kalamu Salam was associated with the workshops. He was a young guy, I think from the lower Ninth Ward, but local New Orleans person who becomes a part of it. And the people in the workshops in generally are local folks. I mean, they sometimes come, like Nia Watkins, who I think was originally from Pittsburgh, but she didn't come to New Orleans to be in the Free Southern Theater. She just ended up in New Orleans for whatever reasons, and then was living there and got interested in this. I mean, the key figure in all this is actually Tom Dent.
Right.
I mean, because he has a real, he'd been the key organizer in terms of putting it together, the Umbra Poets Workshop in the Lower East Side in New York City.
Right, with Ishmael Reed and those folks. Yep.
Ishmael Reed, Askia Touré, a lot of really important, Lorenzo Thomas. There are a lot of really important writers who were involved. So he had, like Lorenzo, when he came south, he had experience in building institutions. He also was a direct connection, by the way, to, in a sense, to the Writers Project, the Federal Writers Project, in the sense that his father was president of Dillard. He remembers seeing L.D. Reddick in the library doing that stuff. He knew who Marcus Christian and Octave Lilly were. And when he got back from New York, he sought out the local people,
Right.
Both, musicians, writers, artists, sometimes, sort of following what, I guess what you might think of as what I think of as the digging the streets ethic of Bohemia and Black Bohemia in New York City, in the Lower East Side and Harlem and East Harlem, that, sought these people out. But he was very much into building institutions, cultural arts institutions. And so he really amps up the workshop. There's a theater's workshop and a writer's workshop, which gets eventually merged into one workshop, which eventually has its own traveling group, its own performing groups and so forth, which separates eventually from Free Southern, becomes the Black Arts South, and actually survives, outlives Free Southern, which eventually, for a variety of reasons, collapses. And is entirely a community oriented organization, really, and then travels and inspires similar organizations all through the South, especially on the Gulf Coast, or the coast from, say, Miami to Houston and Galveston, what I sometimes call the Southern Black Arts Archipelago, because it really is, at least at first, really along sort of that area for some reason. And eventually we'll travel upriver to places like Memphis and Arkansas and Savannah. Not as much to Atlanta, which is an interesting thing.
James, I'd be remiss not to talk to you about what was happening here in Durham during this period, particularly, with Howard Fuller
Right.
and what happens in Hayti and the creation of the Malcolm X Liberation University. Could you
Right.
talk a little bit about that moment, here in North Carolina?
Yeah, well, North Carolina is a happening place in Black power and Black arts. And I mean, partly because it's probably, it's not like Tennessee or DC or Atlanta in the sense that there isn't really an absolute center of HBCUs. I mean, you have places like Nashville, like Atlanta, also DC, which are sort of nexuses
Right.
of a higher Black education, which in North Carolina, it doesn't quite work like that. But in terms of the sheer number of HBCUs and the
Right.
size of them,
Yeah.
it is probably, I mean, I mean, you'd have to go back and run the numbers. I'm more familiar with what they are now, oddly enough, than then. But you're talking about 10,000, I mean, tens
Black
of
college
thousands of
students. Yeah.
Black college students in those.
Yeah.
So that that's enormously important. I mean, there's a reason why the sit-ins start in Greensboro with students from
Greensboro,
Bennett
right.
College and from
Right.
North Carolina.
A&T.
I mean,
Right.
and North Carolina Central University in Durham and North Carolina and A&T alone, they might have had something like 20,000 Black students
Yep.
between them. So that's really important. SNCC is obviously, I mean, SNCC is the first conference of SNCC is at Shaw, right?
Oh, right. In Raleigh. Yep.
So there's this history in there. And what's important also is because of these, and in terms of the arts, is it means all these schools, they have English departments, they have theater people, they have art departments. People
Right.
and people are trained in the applied arts. People are
Right.
trained to teach this stuff.
They have marching bands.
Yeah, marching bands. So you have all this stuff going on there. So the story, like say in Durham, where you're at, is this sort of synergy between community stuff, community activism, North Carolina Central University, which is the overwhelmingly the largest HBCU in the triangle, right? I mean, Shaw is maybe a fifth or sixth the size of that. There's some smaller ones, but that's the big one. And then though there are not that many students at Duke.
Right.
So, first of all, I mean, I think what you have is a lot of sort of cultural and political activity. You have people, Howard Fuller has already been working in the area. We're talking around about 1968 here, 67,
right.
69. And Howard Fuller has already been working in I keep wanting, because you mostly read these things, wanting to say Haiti, but it's not. But
Hayti.
Yeah, Haiti. But he's in the Haiti and other Black communities of Durham, has been doing community organizing around a variety of sort of nuts and bolts, not just civil rights issues in the sense of access, but also in terms of economic issues, in terms of what you might say issues of material well-being, something that would be more in the spirit of Dr. King in the sanitation workers than in some respects than say what we sometimes associate with, I don't know if we associate, but what is sometimes publicly associated with civil rights. It's not just, and so he's doing that kind of community organizing. So you have that, you have students, there's one woman, a graduate of North Carolina Central University, Karen Rux, who was a theater person who works in the theater up north, but also in the South. She does theater work there. There's a radio station that comes, Black radio station, where she has a program. There's this Our Own Thing Theater, which was the Regal Theater, which has people, I gather you would probably know this better than I would, but from what I understand, you know, because of the soul music concerts and sort of dances that went on there at that time under the auspices of our own thing, it's still remembered in Durham fondly, and the Triangle fondly, as a sort of a hotbed of you know, a good time in terms of soul music and dance
Right,
and so
right.
forth. And they had, you know, black arts, black power things. Eventually it was burned, you know, bombed and closed. I don't think they ever, you know, as often happened with these things, ever caught who actually did it.
Right. And then the highway came.
And the highway, well, you know, that's, you know, that was, you know, that's true of so many Southern cities, you know, it's true of Nashville and the Jefferson Street area. It's true in New Orleans and Claiborne, you know, in Treme, and it's true in Richmond. You know, that's one of those. I mean, if you remember, I mean, one of the things I then I'll get back to North Carolina. One of the things I make in my conclusion is thinking about Hurricane Katrina and the destruction it wrought, and the question, at least for a while, which fortunately hasn't been quite as disastrous as we thought it would be in terms of the elimination of Black people and Black institutions and Black cultural memory from New Orleans, is that we, you know, made us think a lot about what happens when the desire projects are raised, essentially.
Right.
What happens when 10,000 Black people are moved out, you know, however miserable they were to live in some respects, were moved out of there. What happens when whole communities are essentially flattened? No, not just in terms of, you know, partly in terms of, you know, people's lives and being scattered from everywhere, from, you know, Memphis to Dallas, Houston, and all over the place, but also what happens to cultural memory?
Right.
What happens to, you know, what happens when you can't go and talk to somebody in the community and say, oh, I don't know about that, but you should talk
But this person will, right?
Smith up the street because she was a part of that. When you can't do that anymore because those people aren't there anymore, it's very distraught. You know, Kalamu Yaslam, you know, has listened to the People Project, was very much around that question of trying to remember what New Orleans was, because when he started doing it, he wasn't sure that New Orleans was ever going to be again the way it was.
What it was.
Black people. My point is that actually, you know, Katrina, that kind of destruction has been going on for a long time in the South, everywhere, but particularly in the South, particularly whether you're talking about Beale Street in Memphis, whether you're talking about Shockoe Bottom in Richmond, whether you're talking about Jefferson Street or Pettigrew Street and Jefferson Street in Nashville, or Pettigrew Street in Durham, or even Auburn Avenue now in Atlanta, or all these places where, you know, in a sense, they're slow-moving Katrinas that have been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
Destroying that. Okay, so, you know, and I think that what happens when we lose that, or, you know, it's you know, it's something that I conclude with thinking about what does it mean, you know, it's a joke, you know, Louis Armstrong, Billie Holiday, what does it mean, this New Orleans, but, you know, anyway, going back there, so what happens, you know, in say in North Carolina, in Durham, is that you have that kind of activity going on from the community at North Carolina Central University, and then at Duke, you know, and it happens pretty quick, really, because the first Black students at Duke, you know, and there are only 5 of them, come in 63.
1963. Yep.
Yeah. So, you know, by the time you get to 68, there's not, you know, there's more, but it's not like a huge number of people, but they're very, very active. They're very active in the struggle for Black studies, in support of Black labor rights of Black workers on campus, cafeteria workers, you know, janitors, you know, custodial workers, whatnot, and they and also more Black students and more Black faculty, and they also are hooked up with the community because a lot of them had gotten summer jobs.
Right.
A significant number of people had summer jobs working with Howard Fuller in his organization, in sort of community organizing in the summertime. So they knew him well.
Right.
And they also knew, besides being an effective organizer, that he was an extremely effective speaker.
Right.
And so, what happens is that there's this struggle at Duke around these questions of more Black students, Black studies, more Black faculty, and was really actually in the first place, I think, galvanized by the struggles of the workers. Right. I mean, they're when that stuff came to a head was what provoked a lot of the activity. And in fact, like a lot of places, and it's interesting how these things work both at HBCUs and PWIs, where you have this autocratic administrative model, which doesn't really like to listen to the faculty much, and they certainly don't want to.
This from the students,
undergraduate students, so like free speech at Berkeley, like what happened at Columbia University in New York, is that there's as I recall, a demonstration, and then mostly around the rights, various issues, but around the rights of the workers, which then and sit in, and then what happens is when they leave, the police are sicked on them, or the sheriff's department is sicked on them, which causes an explosion at Duke, in which, interestingly enough, white students, substantial numbers of them, support the Black students.
Right. The infamous Allen building takeover. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And but what happens is that the students feel they bring in Fuller to help articulate some of their demands, and as a sort of spokesperson also connect with the community. And then what happens is they feel that they're being marginalized, to use a somewhat corny term, but literally marginalized in the sense that there's a task force that's set up to talk about the various issues having to do with Black people on campus, Black students, Black faculty, Black workers, but they shut the students out entirely.
Right.
And that's when the Malcolm X Liberation University idea comes forward. I mean, although, as I also talk in the book, it's part of a larger debate that's going on within the Black freedom movement writ large, Black arts, Black power, about Black higher education, Black studies, and whether it's possible to do like what my own department at UMass attempted to do, or what your department at Duke has attempted to do, which is to build a kind of Black unit, a Black university, kind of a Black institution within a PWI, or whether you needed some sort of freestanding Black university run by Black people, answerable to Black people, for Black people, like Malcolm X University, or People's College, which had a slightly different model, but the same sort of idea in Nashville and Atlanta, or the idea of trying to, essentially transform the HBCUs from being universities and colleges, made up of Black students and Black faculty to a large extent, and Black administrators to a large extent, but not necessarily in the sense of the time a Black university dedicated to Black liberation and Black self-determination. So what happens is then they start that. They never were able to figure out a financial model, I guess is to use the business term for these days, that actually worked. But it was really quite fascinating. And if you think about that opening, you can see the opening ceremonies for Malcolm X Liberation University. And of course, it's a political event an educational event in the sense that we would normally understand it. But, not just in the sort of arts, the clearly arts moments like the Harambe Singers with Bernice Reagan, a sort of forerunner of Sweet Honey in the Rock, doing this amazing performance of which you can see a little bit in the film. but just these the image of Black women in, you know, sort of variations on African, you know, fashion, marching in the streets of Durham, walking through the streets of Durham, North Carolina. And if you think about the arresting image that must have been in the late 1960s in a mid-sized southern city, it was not something you would see every day. That even that itself is a sort of artistic or cultural, what I think of as a kind of Black arts expression of that moment of, you know, to see, just the visuals of it. Whatever else went on, you know, with the relatively small number of students that were in Malcolm X University. I mean, you can imagine being Black and in Durham in that moment and seeing those folks, you know, on Pettigrew Street, say, which is where the university was originally, in Hayti, you know, before, I think just, you know, around the time, but I think maybe before the time where the highway
came
kind
to 147.
separates Pettigrew Street from North Carolina Central, and guts essentially the commercial district of Black Durham. That's incredibly, you know, an incredibly powerful thing. And of course, it's filmed by St. Clair Bourne, who then, you know, for a segment of Black Journal. So what it means is that, you know, Black people all across the country are watching these images from Durham, North Carolina. And again, as we, you know, to circle around to where we began, the notions of the land, the Black nation, and so forth, is, you know, there's really no vision of the Black nation in this country, both for historical and demographic reasons, that doesn't substantially center the South. And just to see these images from the South, and it's not even, you know, I mean, it's not even Atlanta. It's not even New Orleans, where, you know, I mean, you know, people are used to like the idea of African survivals in New Orleans, you know, for various, you know, romantic, possibly, you know, as well as actual historical reasons. But, you know, Durham, North Carolina, you know, and I think in those days, the triangle didn't have the sort of the image of the liberal bastion,
that it is now,
that it does today. That was incredibly powerful, I think.
We've been joined today on Left of Black by Professor James Smethurst, Professor of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's the author of many books, including the classic, The Black Arts Movement, Literary Nationalism in the 1960s and 1970s, which was published in 2005 by UNC Press. Last year, in 2020 rather, he published Brick City Vanguard, Amir Baraka, Black Music and Black Modernity, 2020, University of Massachusetts Press. And he joined us today to talk about his most recent book, Behold the Land, the Black Arts Movement in the South, which Margot Natalie Crawford says is meticulously researched and beautifully written. Behold the Land is bound to become the definitive study of the Black Arts Movement in the South. It's great talking with you, James.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's been a real pleasure.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every Black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All Black everything, everything Black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back. Black